Welcome back. I hope you've all had a really good morning and a good lunch. I'm James Robson. I'm going to chair this session. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Director of SCOPE. That's the Oxford University Centre on Skills, Knowledge and Organisational Performance. Very briefly, we do work focusing on the intersection of education and training and work. And we take a very broad view to that kind of research. We're looking at everything from FE, HE, adult education, but taking a systems-based approach, which really means that we look at a whole range of issues across the political economy of the whole of post-16 education and training. And a key part of that work is really access and participation across all aspects of education and training. One particular project that we have been doing a lot of work on is postgraduate access through a project called Close the Gap. If you're interested in that, please do talk to me about that. But very briefly, a key finding from that has really highlighted how heterogeneous practices around access are, how complex that is, and how context really matters when thinking about participation and access issues. And context is really interesting in terms of this conversation that we're going to have today. One of our key points is that looking at how access activities and initiatives happen at the local disciplinary levels really shapes the kinds of outcomes that we can achieve as institutions at the sector level as well. But context can be disciplinary, and disciplines cross institutional, local, national boundaries. And there's so much we can learn from different global contexts around participation at work. And that is what we're going to talk about today with our panel. We're really lucky to be joined by, in order, John Blake, who is Director for Fair Access and Participation at the Office of Students. John does a huge amount of work as part of that regulatory role. We're really lucky that he's able to join us today. We've got Graham Atherton, who I think you all know, as Director of World Access to Higher Education Network, WAHEN, as well as a whole range of other really important roles at Ruskin and London South. Which university at Graham? University of West London. Thank you. PVT. And we have Danielle Watkis, who's a DPhil student at the department here, who's doing really fantastic research on Black doctoral students' experiences at elite institutions like this one. And we've got Samina Khan, who's Director for Undergraduate Admissions and Outreach at Oxford. And Samina, you'll be able to give us a practitioner perspective on these issues that we'll talk about today. So we're going to have some short presentations from our panel on the issue of what the UK can learn from global discussions around widening access. And then we'll open the floor up for questions and have hopefully a really decent discussion. So John, you'd like to start?
So I wanted to, I was sort of thinking about what I would say here, and I wanted to sort of list off an amazing list of ways in which, when we designed our regulatory framework for quality, which I'm responsible for, in the English system, that we'd done a load of really, really amazing comparisons to wider international systems, but we didn't really do that, and that's and possibly a very expected error. But I think part of the reason is something that so I've worked in education and education policy for my entire career, and I think it's true. HE, as much as education, is often quite exceptionalist as a sector. Says, what we're trying to do is very different from what everyone else is doing, because I think it's a lot about HE regulation. Can't regulate in the same way as other sectors, even though I think it's necessarily true, but also can be at times somewhat genuinely parochial. Like, what's interesting is what we're studying here, and I've always thought that one of the peculiarities of now the United Kingdom is the extent to which we don't routinely necessarily learn from and engage with our partner governments in Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, but perhaps even more acutely the extent to which the British educational policy discourse pays almost no attention to what goes on in Ireland. So I think there is a sort of one of the reasons that I was at the launch of WIDEning and so pleased to see it happen is I think really genuine opportunities for policymakers to think about how other systems are dealing with the same sets of problems is really important. I don't think it's as routine as it should be. That said, I think the other thing that we do have some experience of in other parts of education in England is where people have decided to go abroad and they've seen something and they've decided that they're going to take it lock, stock and barrel back to England and it will work immediately. It's what Tim Oates at Cambridge Assessment would have called policy shopping, where you sort of go over and see, well, this works in Finland, and we'll come back and we'll do it with an entirely different system and different people, and we won't do any analysis of how that fits within the wider social culture. So I think there's a really important balance of doing those things, of understanding actually what is genuinely exceptional, what's genuinely different. All of that said, I think there are two things that I would particularly draw out at this moment, and that indeed have been addressed at this conference today, where I think there is really powerful learning. One, which I think is a positive one, has been the frequent reiteration of the importance of bottom-up implementation of meaningful change. That and the English system, the English education system in general, is often very prone to quite high-level systematic changes that will change the national curriculum, will change the qualification framework, or will change the regulations. And of course, those have impacts and changes. But the extent to which they have the intended impacts and changes depends enormously on what goes on in tens of thousands of interactions within the institutions concerned. And I think I was hearing some really fascinating stuff earlier about the experiences of doing work on equality in Malta and the extent to which that, ultimately, yes, you want buy-in from leaders at sector and institutional level, but the real difference is driven by those decisions at the front line. I think particularly in the English system, we still haven't overcome an unfortunate bifurcation between and again, I should say everything I'm saying here is like everything in English higher education. It's true somewhere, but it's not true everywhere. But in too many places, there's still a bifurcation between those who are dealing with the questions of equality within institutions and those who are actually teaching on the front line. There's obviously lots of merger, lots of exchange in lots of places, but it's not continuous, it's not complete, it's not coherent, and often it frustrates the changes that need to happen. And I would just give as an example some of the work we've uncovered through the Disability in Higher Education Advisory Panel, where, again, in common with everybody else that's investigated this question, we found institutions that are spending an enormous amount of time and effort trying to work out what the reasonable adjustments for students might be, and then seeing them not implemented by academics. And I should be clear, not for profoundly immoral reasons that they just don't care, but because they feel they don't have the time or the expertise or the experience to do those things. I still think there needs to be some of that brought together. I think and I think the fact that that is an international experience, and that importance of focusing on implementation in those final spaces between students and those who work with them is really important. And the other thing, much more depressing, is that we're learning the importance of endlessly revalidating the significance of an independent higher education sector. And I say that as one of the people who's charged with making that sector slightly less independent in this country through regulation. It is our job to hold institutions accountable in ways that are often unfamiliar, frequently uncomfortable, and make real challenges. And I make no apology for doing that. I think we should do that. But at the same time, what is going on in the United States, I was hearing just in the session I was there about some of the things that are happening in the Indian system, should remind us that we value autonomous institutions in higher education not as a matter of historical accident or convenience, because if you don't, vice chancellors will whine you. We value it because in a constitutional democracy, the existence of a knowledge-creating curation and communication engine that is not under the control of the state is fundamentally important to all of our freedom, and that the accountability that I speak for notwithstanding, there also has to be recognition that lots of that knowledge won't necessarily be very good or right or even useful. It might, you might not like it, but the whole point is you don't know what of that knowledge is before you get there. You can't know that. And the state needs to be extraordinarily cautious about intruding into the autonomy of institutions. It doesn't mean it shouldn't do it. It doesn't mean it can't be justified where it happens, and it doesn't mean that it can't be helpful where it happens. But it does need to be cautiously thought through, because the price of the erosion of such independence is the damaging of an actually remarkably powerful instrument for reflecting back to us aspects of our society, of our world, of our own experiences that we might not agree with, that we might not want to hear, that we might not fully understand, but that which fundamentally is incredibly important for us as individuals, communities, and societies, coming to grips and terms with the world that we inhabit and how we work and shape it. And I think as a regulator, it is important we keep doing our job, but it is important we hold in our heads why an autonomous, high-functioning, independent higher education sector is of value, not just to the economy, though it is, but also to our society and our constitutional democracy. And I think the current moment brings home that every single day in ways that I know we wish it wouldn't, but it is, if there is any good there, to be reminded of those things and for other governments to think about them seems to be important.
Thanks, John. Really good to be reminded. Can you bring out the issue around public good very, very nicely? It's very reassuring to have the regulator emphasising that. Graham.
Yeah, I think firstly, looking at the UK in terms of the global context where equitable access and success is concerned, it's worth remarking initially that the structures which John oversees, particularly in terms of the existence of an agreement between individual education providers and the state or regulator with regards to equitable access and sex work, is very rare. In fact, there's very few countries around the world that have anything like that. The level of commitment is very strong. Now, Jamil, who was on the screen earlier on, mentioned a piece of work that he did when we were prior to WAHEN, where we just had World Access to Education Day, did a piece of work looking at policy with regard to equity and access around 70 countries in the world. He looked at, and I think the 6 or 7 countries where he found the greatest level of commitment, England, Scotland, Wales, and work with those countries. So, the outset, there's a relatively high level of commitment here in the UK to this issue, comparatively. In terms of research that Jamil's done, I done some research in that space as well. However, it doesn't mean other things happening across the world that we can't be very aware of in the UK. The first one may be regarding to place, for instance. Now, place is quite interesting because a lot of discussions today have been around the impact of what's happening in the US and that ripple effect that's across the world with regards to the relationship between the state and the education system. However, it's worth noting that essentially speaking in the US, the education system is state-led, not federal level. It's not run in the same way from one place like it is in the UK. It's run at state level. Now, however much influence the president can have, it's run at state level. And the states essentially have influence over what happens to that state of education, also the private system. I made that point because it's also worth noting that, I'm sure it hasn't changed in the past 4 or 5 months, that one thing to think about is when you talk about education equity and access, what happens at regional level within a country? Because we are in the UK and England, a very centralised country, where London dominates in many different ways. There's a large debate at the moment in England, and you in particular, this government, of how you devolve power away from London and give regions and cities more autonomy, more power about a range of things, including the educational outcomes as well. Going back to the US, in the US, for instance, in quite a number of US states now, there is free higher education on offer to certain groups in that state. In New York, there's something called the Excelsior program, which gives free higher education to certain those who live within New York State, earning a certain underneath a certain level of income. Same in Mexico. Mexico is even bigger. Mexico City's a bigger program. Comes across the US. I was talking to somebody in Bogota last week. They have a very interesting system in Bogota, again in that town, in that city, where they have a state-led scholarship program in Bogota in Colombia. My point being that there are regional approaches to this challenge, which we will see across the world, which is something to think about here in the UK, where we're trying overall to be more regional, more devolved in our powers. That's one thing to think about. Second thing I think about is, again, how we do things differently. Now, I'm not saying we should do things this way, but for instance, the use of quotas. Now, John referred earlier on to hearing about the Indian higher education system. Those who know anything about the Indian higher education system will know that there's a quota system there for those particular caste groups. Reserve quota places in higher education for different caste groups. That's one way, particularly, I think, on a larger point. If you look around the world and look at comparative work in this area, it's how we look at particular groups of learners. Quite interesting. Now, the groups of learners might be different, but there are specific groups of learners quite interesting. So the caste system in India, there will be a quotas, for instance. Interesting way of looking at that kind of issue. Not saying we should do that here in the UK, but there are other ways of doing things. I think part of the challenge we have here in the UK is because, yes, we've been committed to this area of work recently, over 25 years now. I first came into this work in 1999, when there really wasn't a kind of space where you had widening access, equitable access work in the UK. There wasn't access to participation plans, didn't exist when I first started this kind of work. Over my career, I've seen increase in importance, and the big group, a community of people within the UK who devote their time, their work, and their professional life to this area of work, which I've been part of. I mean, that of course means that when you do develop that strong community, as John pointed out, it's not always the case you have the capacity to look outside. I think one of the things important to try and think about doing that. We talk about region, we talk about particular ways of dealing with particular groups as well. I think another reflection on what we see across the world is thinking about what countries we look at. Because I think in the UK, you compare yourself to different countries. Now, Australia being an example. History is historically, system relatively similar in size. Okay. Look to the US, there's that, what we call the Atlantic gaze, what happens over there we look at. I would encourage again us to look at different kinds of countries. Now, there is a paper, I think Maria's, her people may have given her paper or not. Maria, I know very well from Austria. Austria's an interesting country. They are really taking forward some of this work in Austria via similar agreements to the ones that John leads, but in a slightly different way. Now, Europe overall is patchy in this area. Doesn't have the same kind of commitment at country level, but Croatia, Austria, interesting countries in that regard. But other countries, for instance, South Africa, there's an example. South Africa, very particular history as a country, of course, as we know, apartheid, etc. Obviously, history in terms of who participates and succeeds in higher education. Yet there is a wealth of innovative activity going on in South Africa, using data, for instance, in ways that we're not doing actually the same degree here in our system in the UK, which overall is much richer, well-funded system than South Africa's. So I really encourage again in the UK context to look at different types of countries. Don't just look at, let's say, what's happening in Australia or the US. Germany's not so committed in this space, but think of other ways of looking at examples. I'd say, John, you can't. It's not policy shopping and policy borrowing, but it's the point of widening at the end of my piece is that with widening we're trying to create a space where, as a global community in this area, we can look at what our compatriots are doing in other places. We can share that experience and find comparator learning we didn't think existed before. Because we won't know what that learning will look like until we get into that discussion. But we need a framework and space to do that. Essentially, that is what widening's all about. I'll leave it at that point. But as I say, I think through widening, hopefully we can all, through events like this, the beauty of events like this, of course, is we come and hear about things in countries where we didn't think that was relevant to our work. We go away from what we think things are relevant, we look at places, yeah, maybe that country is relevant to us. We expect that to be the case. But coming and thinking about other places where we see relevant. So I guess the beauty of an event like this today, and hopefully through this morning, this afternoon, we'll all get some of that. Thanks, Graham.
Yeah.
I'm happy actually to stop talking at that point, that reality that there is other locations and places where us as the UK can learn from. I think when you're positioned as if you know it all and positioned as if you're the lead on this matter, you don't have the space to open up to learn from other nations that are actually doing great work. And so I think that's a valid point, and it leads on to the reality that somehow even in some of the conversations globally, it seemed as if, oh, this is new. And for many people that's been in the work, we're like, oh, history is repeating itself. But I guess because we didn't have appreciation of some of the research that has been happening on some of these topics, it's like we're starting again or seeing new ways of doing it. But it highlights to me where we've not gone into that deep appreciation of some of the scholars and work that has been done way before, but burning of books has happened before. That's nothing new, for example. The changing of narratives of a culture that has been perpetuating throughout the history of time, through human history. So it's not a new thing when we're engaging in such work of access, and we're now being faced with a new set of narratives to navigate. So I feel like we need to keep in mind that we have to engage with the works that has been done as well, before we just say, oh, let's just move forward, but we're back at history again, or we're back at a point that's just dressed differently. There's like a phrase that people said, how those colonized lands, they used to go with guns, now they wear suits and have institutions. It's still some of the same, giving ideas on the way of how a system should run, but dressed very differently. And so I think one of the ways that we can learn is seeing how things are forming and now what is actually shaped in different clothings. And I want us to bring to a reality that these kinds of work, I want everyone to be encouraged to continue these kind of work, not downplay it now, but these kinds of work with humans, diversity, inclusion, they are messy. Humans are messy, coming collectively, all of us trying to negotiate how we should navigate systems and develop structures with everyone in this room and your idea of education and what your main purpose, your family background, all of that coming in together to have a conversation is a kind of rich work that needs to be done. And so when we think we can just remove a narrative or remove the history of how we're teaching in different nations, it doesn't actually change the reality that there's several narratives still going. And that's why we see I think one of the factors of the rise of these mental health crises is that the identities are being pushed under because we want to try and cancel work on EDI. It's going to come up again unless we come to some of these kind of conversations. What are they doing in this nation? What are we doing now? And so I do want us to kind of have that in the back of our minds, that where we're seeing these national changes I know we're bringing up the US more frequently because I guess it's more current news, and many people are starting to become more aware of this. But I think what we are able to learn is that we have to make sure that we are not repeating the complacency that we think everything was okay and that we take a backbench on these topics. It's actually time now to go more forward on this and go with the actual why. I think before maybe it may have been, oh, we need to do this because this is the work, this is where we might get fundings, this is where we would increase more international students. I think we had a kind of conversation on the prices of them probably coming over for us. But I think at this time, we need to look at that and say, what is actually the main why we're engaging in work of widening access? How are we now going to not just stop at that point to change the culture? Because I'm more on by the experiential access, not just at the point at the front door, but beyond the doors of coming into space, because that is contributing back again to the same door handle. So I think those are some of the thoughts I want to put forward in when we're looking at the UK in comparative to other nations. We need to realise there has been some historical work, that this is not something new. We've just disregarded some of this knowledge and epistemologies from many researchers, and we've not fully engaged in it in a lot of ways now.
Thank you. I'm not sure how to follow that. I'm going to try though. So thank you very much for inviting me, and it's really nice to be in Northern Gardens, where actually my educational journey started many years ago. So thanks for the invite. I'm going to sort of I have reflected on what to say here today from the point of view of the role that I'm in. And what I'm about to say isn't necessarily Oxford University policy, but it's a wish list I wish that Oxford would look at. And I think we're right. We talk a lot about HE access and participation here in the UK. So it's not surprising we're sort of, when we do these sort of league tables, we are there. But we look at it very much from a domestic student. That is very limiting. It's very limiting indeed, because actually, as you know, Graham and many others have been saying for many years, that HE access should go beyond borders. And that is a challenge for some of us, particularly in certain climates where HE access for international students is automatically linked to immigration numbers and things like that. So we're immediately channeled off into that direction, which is not positive. So it's really, for me, it's a call for policymakers and regulators to have a look at, perhaps to go beyond the narrow conversations that we have around international students and broaden that to start to look at international HE access, particularly for undergraduates. So that's really what I think is really important. And I think then it's for senior leadership in HE institutions to be brave and to pick that up and to be leading on that, to say access to HE, not just about domestic students, but it has to be about international students if we are to be part of this global community. Then I started to think about, okay, that's great, but what are the things that we then not need to start to think about to put into place? The first thing really is we have to address here is financial barriers. We're not going to get very far unless there are meaningful financial support in place for access to higher education. I'm talking particularly about the UK, and where undergraduate scholarships, undergraduate financial support is pretty limited and very much depends upon philanthropic giving to some individual who's got some vision. So I think that that's sort of really important to make sure that whoever we invite to our institutions can absolutely, as you've already said, before people sit through the door, they turn up with their suitcases at the Porter's Lodge, they've got to be able to go through and to be successful and have a good time. I think the other thing as well is, it's a little bit of a nod to the policy shopping that John mentioned. We can't just sort of adopt policies and say, this is what we're going to do, how's it going to implement it. I think we've also got to go beyond that and be able to look at the context, the cultural capital international students are bringing, particularly access ones, what their lived experiences, what has been their educational journey to date, and what can we learn from their educational journey? Can we address our own selection criteria, our own definition of what academic potential is by looking at what they have achieved and how they have achieved it, and therefore not just compare what they've done to the benchmarks that we've had in place for a long time. So I think that's really important. Also, I think in terms of HE and international access, we've got to go to sort of break this habit of only talking to them once they're in the last few years of compulsory education. We've got to start this conversation at a much earlier age. And some of these ideas that I'm suggesting here is because I've listened to and seen and engaged with many projects from across the world and seen what they are doing. And I think a lot of the sort of things that I've come across in some of the research is that unless you start to introduce the vocabulary of HE at a very younger age, this person is always going to be playing catch up. So it's really important that we can do that and engaging with them, right from primary. And that conversation then continues into secondary so that we are then developing their skills around academic confidence, self-reflection, independent learners. So they have those tools already. And we're not asking them to develop their tools in the summer just before they apply to a UCAS or something like that. So I think that is really important. And then lastly, just to challenge ourselves to look outside of traditional classroom experiences. And there are many, I think, grassroots projects that I've seen where the supplementary teaching is actually where students begin to shine, and how can we tap into that rich vein. And then just lastly to say, access just doesn't stop once students in. Obviously, participation is important as well. Participation doesn't just stop when they've graduated, as has already been mentioned. So much work is now starting in terms of postgraduate.
Thank you. Thank you all for fantastic starting presentations. I think this is a really, really important set of points you made. And just very briefly, Jonathan, you highlighted the UK aspect really nicely, that there's actually a lot of learning that needs to go on within the UK. That's really important. And thinking about the role of the state in all of this and how heavy that hand should or needs to be is a key part. Graham, I think the point about place is really well made. Yeah, the sort of shift to thinking and talking about regional system, really important. What that means for access. Danielle, I think you highlighted really nicely that we're not just talking about issues across space, we're talking about issues across time as well. So that sort of space and what we learn across space and time is so important, particularly given how messy humans are. Serena, I think your point about international access is so crucial. I think it was a point made earlier on this morning as well, that actually we need to move the discourse beyond domestic students and talk much more broadly about this through the lens of financial barriers and shift it also into postgraduate as well. So this is a great opportunity to have a conversation, bring questions. Colleagues online, do put your questions in the chat and I'll bring you in. Would anyone in the room like to start? Yes.
I have a question in relation to presenting from international WP that can allow us to work on what sometimes feels like a difficult conversation in WP for me and an access professional, which is that we have what would seem like an expensive higher education system for young people with disadvantaged backgrounds. I saw in a presentation earlier that we are a bit of an outlier in the OECD compared to other countries in terms of how much students pay versus the state. And I know it's a conversation I have to have a lot with the young people I work with, from the most economically disadvantaged backgrounds and otherwise, that it can still feel like a huge barrier going to university with this idea of the debt burden, but also how much it costs to be a student at the moment. And I wonder if there's any learning from abroad and other countries that we can take that can allow us to have both great policy, interest and commitment to WP, whilst also bringing the costs of HE down for the students.
Thank you. Excellent question. Would you mind just saying who you are and where you're from?
So my name is Claudia Lusardi and I am from the Connect Partnership that I work to improve access to education tools.
So got an easy question, but who wants to jump in? Graham?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you're right to say that across the OECD we have the highest cost system per capita student investment. In the US, some institutions are more expensive, but on average, essentially cheaper. So yeah, I mean, in terms of what you can learn from doing your job, then not the people in the world have to do the job that you have to do, because you don't have to talk about it the same way. There's not inequality, but often it's cheaper, or in some cases actually free. I mean, I guess if you look at the US, it's probably the most useful comparator, given that it's probably the next overall biggest expensive system we know more about. Then I think I suppose the student advice in this area itself has become a more significantly sized area, if you like, area of work. You know, I guess what all you can say is that the kind of thing you're doing, to what extent is there preparation, training, support around the acknowledgement that has to be at that level of advice? Or is it being tapped onto somebody's other role? I mean, occasionally you're doing this work, you're doing other work as well. Who does it in schools outside of you? When does it start? When does it begin? The one thing you'll say about the US is that because it's acknowledged that you have to pay to go to higher education, as pretty much always been the case, the understanding you have to pay is ingrained from earlier on and ingrained possibly through the system in a way it isn't here. That's all I would say from a practical point of view. The difference in the US, of course, is that the availability of kinds of financial support is much wider. But you've got primarily a unitary form of support here with a state-backed loan system with some scholarships ticked around the side. In the US, you've got state level support, you've got possible Pell Grant, federal support. There's a multiplicity of foundations and charities in a complex space. It means you have a dedicated strand of work around financial advice. I argue with B, we don't have that within the widening access space here. We don't have a dedicated stream around finance. So one of the things I argued for years, I got bored of arguing about it, is that we never tackle the question, what should a year 8 young person know about student finance? They need to know how much the fees are. They need to know you have to pay. What do they need to know? What do year 9 student have to know? Year 10 student have to know? I put this out everywhere. Nobody listened to that. And 10 years ago, with no advance, zero advance, in my experience in knowing where we are with that. Now, that again is, if you go to the US, that level of knowledge around that, what happens with the spaces, because you have to be, it's a bigger system as well. That's the only advice I give you on that one. In terms of from a policy point of view, yes, I mean, you would argue that on the flip side, I guess in the OECD, we do have one of the strongest forms of financial support, be it backing for long-back support. If you look at systems where it's free, also there is no statutory loans available for students to actually borrow any money at all to fund being at university. So the actual loan system is quite good in that respect, but of course it's
Well, I mean, just to say, I pay attention.
yeah, I know you do, John. I know you do.
But also partly because I think, the point also Samira made, which is that like we have to do a lot of this much earlier, and I think the OFS funds the Uniconnect partnerships, and we've been doing quite a significant amount of work. I'm not going to claim lots of credit for that because we felt them very late and very not very convenient. That's the government's fault, not mine. Please don't blame me. But we've been trying to do a lot of work on what the future of that needs to look like in order to sustain exactly that kind of system. What is it you think students need to know at different stages? And we're also launching fairly soon a sort of student information group to try and better understand that. I mean, I think there's two things that I would say, and it's not my job to tell the government how to do any of these things. It's my job to regulate it. But I think there's two things I think are quite interesting. One is that every single time we've raised fees in this system, people have said it will stop disadvantaged students going to higher education, and they keep going. And as somebody who occupied a freezing cold exam schools 20 years ago in order to protest against the 2004 Act, in the absolute conviction that other disadvantaged students wouldn't go and they carry on going anywhere, I feel they were very ungrateful for that really quite unpleasant night I spent on cold floors. And I think that's partly because the demand for higher education, we should remember this route structure is incredibly high, incredibly powerful, but we're still well short of what the Millennium Cohort Study suggests, people who want access to higher education. So it's incredibly powerful. And I think fees, I don't mean they're nothing to do with that. But I think what we're talking here about much more is living costs. And that seems to be what we're seeing in the data now. We're seeing more students commuting to staying home, living at home. And my hunch is that that's not, some of that might be of choice and reflect a genuine value. I suspect some of it isn't. And I think that's part of the challenge. So I think there's those two balances, ensuring that they understand what their choices are, but also ensuring those choices are real. But precisely because the fee has been the object of political conversation for 25 years, that's all we talk about. I don't actually think that's the problem. In some ways, the stuff, the government, we're going to raise it by £250. It's going to be really, really difficult. That went by without a hitch, really. That's not been the issue. The issue is students not being able to live when they get to higher education and then falling out. And in some ways, I think this is where the drive to go to EDGE is actually a real problem. Students are like, I'm desperate to go to EDGE. I will bear almost any living cost problem to carry on being in there. So I will work full time. I will cut classes when I can because I'm going to be in the job. So you're actually ending with a complete bifurcation of experience between privileged and non-privileged students. That simply wasn't the case when I went to higher education 20 years ago. and I went as first and family disadvantaged student. You know, I didn't have the money my friends had, but I didn't have to work all the time. You know, I think I'm really worried that we're seeing that disappear.
And then we'll bring in Age.
So, Clive, I'm not necessarily going to get answer your question, but I share where you're coming from. I think some of the things I just want to mention, quite simple observation, really. I think the data shows us only part of the story. Great numbers are not going down just because of fees increase, but I think, and particularly I think coming out of COVID with cost of living crisis, becoming increasingly debt averse, and actually, okay, tuition fees, this is part of the story. How am I actually going to live? How am I actually going to pay my rent? And be successful in my studies as well. I think it's driving behaviour, it's driving what choices students are taking. So we know students from sort of Oxford's regional spots, they're not coming here because it's perceived to be much more expensive. I can get a sort of a much cheaper education at home. So it's driving that sort of behaviour, and they are making those choices based on financial reasoning. I think the other thing, just to bring it back to the sort of international access points, is just talking as we've recently out in Pakistan talking to parents. They said it's all fine. But what we are constantly subject to is external sort of international exchange rates. We might be able to afford you, and something happens in our country and everything just drops. And that means that we are invested. We can't invest in something that's so expensive for 3 years. So there are those sorts of challenges as well. And I think we need to sort of also to be able to identify disadvantage better as well. So because at the moment, you know, we get access to free school meals, which is great, but we know there's a lot of disadvantage that happens just often, you know, beyond that cutoff. So I think, you know, if we had access to more data, once the students apply to us, individual level data, then maybe those universities could do more in terms of supporting students beyond just the tuition fees, but give them bursaries, help them with the accommodation, which is critical.
It's an incredibly rich conversation, by the way, so thank you for all the contributions. I think so policy borrowing and policy transfer is a thing, public policy. It's what governments do. Some are interested, some listen, but you go for all the time, including higher education. Nicholas Barr on the LSE was writing stuff about tuition fees back in the early 2000s when we were messing about them in government. So it is there, but it's striking that the sector itself, the standing government, hasn't picked up this sort of invitation, I think, that Graham was pursuing, which is that there are lines of comparison to avoid naive policy transfer, which is the thing we shouldn't be trying to do. So notwithstanding that, I think there is a bit of infrastructure. I welcome it. That's why I think it's a really rich conversation. I'm going to nominate 2 or 3 things that I think could actually be sort of runners for tenant. First is that in the WP debate, certainly in this country and many other countries, we always had the refrain of Vice Chancellor saying, well, it's all very well, but I don't run the schools. That will not run the schools, and if they can't educate poor kids sufficiently well, etc., etc. It's always, let me run the university and I'll make the university friendlier for poor or disadvantaged. But I think that's breaking down. I think that there's a blurring taking place here. Outreach programs are an obvious example, enabling programs are another example. Connect. So part of it's awareness raising, part of it's skills, but part of it can be, go back to a country we perhaps shouldn't be comparing too much with, which is Australia, which is universities being present in the compulsory schooling system for credit. That is definitely breaking down. So this changes things. So there's a point that you can start looking at some comparisons when VCs aren't just running universities. I think this is the one thing to watch. The second one you may want to do is look at what I following from Graham said, which is on the region thing. I think the regional higher education economy is changing. So I mean in a spatial sense. Where are kids and young people going to universities within regions and looking at that over time, in a relatively short period of time, in 5, 6, 7 years, that higher education economy in some places is changing very, very rapidly. In other places, it's quite static. That gives you a possibility to start doing this sort of, not cross-national, but intra within country. So I think that's potentially a rich area to look at. And I think the third probably has to be this fact that because of different financial arrangements, more and more students combining earned employment with part-time study, even full-time degrees. Now, countries come with completely different approaches to that, but there's a larger mass of students who are sort of mixing that. I think that's another area you could go. So not the normal lines of comparison, but look at the themes and trends that are being identified and see if we can make something of that. Because that then allows you to answer a separate question, which is with a limited number of public dollars or pounds or private dollars and pounds, where are you going to get optimality? Where's the best place to spend your scarce dollar or pound? It's terribly important to get that right. But once you see those sort of trends, well, my point is trends give you a line of comparison which could stimulate and in fact fertilize a kind of cross-national WA network, WP network. Sorry.
I'd like to.
On the regional point, I think Graham was absolutely right about the importance of place. I think I've been interested in place for a very long time, and I think it's starting dissatisfying in the English political system where place tends to be understood as here's a Whitehall programme, you can put the name of your town in front of it, and then you should do whatever we've told you to do. And I think we need to get people better at that. I think one of the things with the regional HEBs is for the government to pay more attention to. Does it want the geographically immobile student to be able to access within some sort of plausible set, distance around their home, what the geographically mobile student can access? Because to be clear, if you're geographically mobile, whatever is wrong with us, is actually you can probably find what you need and do it really well if you're highly geographically mobile. If you're not, you can't. But there are parts of the country where you have to go to the northeast. It's got 5 universities from north to south, loads of really good ethnic colleges, covers the full scope. They're all good, all cover the spectrum from highly selected down to vocational community led. Brilliant. Fine. Is that they may have problems, but you've got a network there to do that. Do you want that somewhere else? That's not what it looks like in the northwest. It's not what it looks like in the south. So I think sort of thinking about how the regions relate to what national offering. I also think on the it's nice to think that the we don't run schools thing is slightly break down. I spent almost all my time in this job pointing out to people that it may not be your fault, but it is your problem as an HE system. Although I will just share one amazing anecdote that I had with a senior leader of a university of Tool, and they named us. But we just don't know anything about running schools. I pointed out that they actually literally did run a school named after the institution, and that their education department was one of the most highly rated in the world. And it did feel a bit like, and if you don't know how to improve it, but where even I would say there is a problem, is that we are governed by a Department for Education where, despite universities having moved from the Department of Business back into HE1, nearly 10 years ago, it doesn't feel like we have a single coherent system that runs from primary all the way up to secondary. And so a classic example of that is that England has loads of statutory external assessment points, none of which were designed to speak to any of the others. They were all built at different times, and the ways in which you work out how the data is supposed to be something else is all incredibly weird algorithmic tables that have been cooked up somewhere. There are real examples where we still don't have that coherence across both, and I think that would allow much stronger conversations about what we're learning.
I think your point about vice chancellors feeling that they don't have any input responsibility over schools is a very important one, because I think it may be changing to extent. I think, taking European example, I think Europe, in the time I've been in international work, 10, 15 years, hasn't overall been as engaged in the question of widening access as perhaps, say, Australia, Canada, UK, US is, possibly because the way in which inequality is framed in Europe is slightly different, systems are slightly different. I'll give you an example. I went to Germany about 7 or 8 years ago to do a talk about widening access, talking to a colleague there. A charity, she'd taken a group of rectors, i.e. essentially vice chancellors from Germany, to the US on a study tour. They went on the US, went to US universities, and they got a presentation from some presidents, US institutions. And after the second or third university they visited, one of the rectors said to the lady who's organising the visit, "Why is it on the second or third slide they tell us about this diversity and inclusion work they do and this work on access they do? Because the German rectors, it just wasn't a thing. Why they tell us that? Because in the US it is a bigger thing. But I think that's changing. My other point about that, though, I think that's a really, really important debate to have in terms of developing systems. If you look globally, taken outside again in the US, UK, Australia. Yes, I know hopefully there'll be increased students in Australia as part of the Accord, and hopefully that's see happen here. But the trends in terms of globally, where over the next 20 years, growth in student numbers will not be in Western Europe, it won't be North America, it'll be in Africa, it'll be in Asia. The opportunity for widening access, probably having Europe, US, Australia, etc., is when we built our university systems, it was for a small number of students from certain backgrounds. And that culture and structure is built into our systems. And people like us have spent our lives fighting against that system. The opportunity is you've got systems developing and being built across the world now. To build into those systems, equity as a concern, as a theme, is a way that to make progress in a way that we can't think of it. I'll bring it back to your discussion. And part of that theme is, what does a university do? What should a university's responsibility be? How should it engage with parts of society? Back to your point you made this morning, should a university just be about its own concern? And that's kind of that form. So I think that's, to me, is where the big challenge, big opportunities for access are in those countries, the systems that are growing.
I'm very interested in this relationship between schools and universities. Actually, just about is receiving students rather than doing something. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, let's look at the universities who have run schools. So King's College has run the King's Maths School, very selective, very limited in terms of the curriculum offer, and that's been successful. I've also known of universities in the East Midlands, I won't name them, but they ran schools, and all the schools ended up in special measures. So, you know, we've got extremes happening. It depends what we mean by running schools, or is it working in collaboration with schools? What can we bring to our local schools or national schools in that would benefit the students? Is it about widening the curriculum that's on offer? Is it about talking about cross-discipline activities? Is it about building skills like academic confidence, self-reflection? Is it about us being able to go in and do those sorts of things? Or is it actually about financially running the school? I think if it's the former, I think you're probably going to see more examples of that rather than the latter. So I think it's, and also how much do schools want us to go in? And I think so there's an awful lot of outreach that happens across the UK, where students and outreach practitioners are going up and down the country, going into school, doing something, and then off they go. Now that has a limited effect. I think we need to start to sort of look at working more closely with senior leadership of schools, saying what's on your school improvement plan, what can we do to work with you to support you. And then, you know, then maybe that's where the more sophisticated conversation happens. We can start to implement more meaningful school engagement. I think there are some small activities of that. You've probably seen more of that than me, John, but I know from how we engage with schools, we are changing how we do that. And it's much more about sustained contact and what skills, what resources, what can we bring? Rather than us saying, going in and saying, right, we need to do this, you need to do that. We tell them, then we go. It's never really going to work. So I think we are better than we used to be, but it's an awful lot more.
Just to pick up on one of the things that came up very clearly in the work that we did on the UniConnect networks was the importance of sustained engagement with students over time. I think we haven't got the same evidence base that you can extrapolate that quite quickly to why that would also work from a school's perspective. And I think getting away from that very transactional sort of arriving in the car park, telling students to go, and then I think that's absolutely right. And we are seeing a lot more of that. But there are genuine challenges the sector faces to do with money and capacity, and then there are slightly less genuine challenges they face to do with willingness to do it. I think it's about trying to shift them into a place where, and I think one of the things that's been really important to my work in the last 3.5 years has been being clear that it's all right to try and fail, but it's not all right not to try. We've got to get better.
I think you're right. I think it's all right to fail, but you can't fail when you've got young people's lives involved.
No, but
I think the other thing that does also drive the behaviour of universities is regulation and budget. And I'm certainly on this, forgive me. And it's I have seen policy do a massive U-turn as soon as they realise they're going to be regulated by Ofsted.
Yeah, well, and I mean, one of the sorry, this is a tiny niche one, but I do think But that's why I think it's really, I mean, I worked in the school sector and was regulated by Ofsted, and it's like many of the reasons building a regulatory system that rested on an analysis of the underlying problems and asking institutions to think about what they felt they could do to it, rather than saying do X, Y, and Z, was precisely because I saw what happened when you had a school system that had an inspectorate that said, just do this. And what you end up with is incredible poisonous mutations across the system, whereby people were doing, I mean, the ones that are like triple marking was a sort of amazing discovery in schools. You mark it, the student would mark it, and then you give it back to the market again. It was all based on one idea that someone had, and it just spread across the system. And I think, there is a maturity that we need to build in our systems, where when we think about the state's involvement, there is also, and it comes back to the implementation point. What does it actually look like when you implement? And it's hard for policymakers to do that because, it's enormously attractive to stand up and say, we're going to change this big thing and it's going to be very exciting. And then it looks good and it looks, but actually when you get down to the level of, the 24-year-old access professional who's been doing it for a year, working with students in the classroom, actually what changes their behaviour is probably not a document that was written in whiteboard. I think in some ways the theme of all of this is how do you work out what that chain of implementation actually is, and how do you manage it properly to achieve the outcomes you want, whilst also being open to the fact that as you build it, the feedback from others who are involved and their different lived experiences may bring you some really important challenges about what you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it.
I'm just going to take the opportunity to bring you in here, Daniel. Is there anything that sort of your research, I think, particularly brings student to the heart of this? That's great.
Yeah, I think initially we opened up and we highlighted that oftentimes we start from the top in some of the conversation, this policy, that policy, but actually engage with those that are like feeding through the system. The teachers, we already see the work and overload that they're doing to now prepare some of the younger ones in another way will require further support in that regard. And these younger generations, what they're aspiring to. And so I feel like, yeah, in some of these grassroots work, and similar to how you said, we've seen a lot of grassroots work being done. I feel like some of them need to be not in silos, but also in conversations. And so we can see what is actually working that we're already doing even as a nation, but because it's doing in grassroots work, which may have their limited amount of people, but we could build upon that. And so I think there's an importance of understanding more of the psychoanalysis of our current generation as well, in terms of even how they're engaging with communications. I think a lot of times we haven't talked about how they're engaging with like social media and how they're developing their ideas on the future. And so there's a world that, for example, me as a student or somebody that's on the ground, there's a world that I have access to that maybe the policy leaders don't have access to because it's another world. And so we need to have more in multidisciplinary kind of conversations when we are building or discussing the next steps of policies.
I think we've come to the end of the session, but I did just see one hand go up. I am actually going to squeeze one final question in. We can be quick.
I'm Zoe from the Teachers Foundation. My quick question is, I'd like to think about the independent and autonomous structure of the universities, but how does this structure influence their capacity to support young people who are not in education and encourage them to
Thank you. Well, let's use this as an opportunity to go around the panel and sort of have that.
I think that university is recognising non-traditional routes to education, and that's really important, and being able to be more flexible in admissions criteria. I also think that the sort of the continuing education departments of the university can play a big part in terms of access. So in particular for adult returners who have had no independent qualifications but have had so much of the experience, that's could be much more.
Yeah, and there's going to be more of the projects, like there's the gap and some of the differences. It's a real complex story. So I think that we actually do need to look at some of the earlier stages in conversation. And work as people that's already on ground like you. I think having you in some of these conversations on the policies and seeing them face to face is going to be probably something that we need to see more of, more engagement of those that are representing the current role models that are trying to inspire the next generation.
Yeah, I would say, as I mentioned earlier on, I think if you're interested in really thinking about how education can reach those groups which appear to be very outside the systems at the moment, is to look at what happens in other parts of the world, where we can learn so much from how those systems deal with groups who are very distant from our education, due to history, due to conflict often, due to religion, but distant than we are in this country. And as much as we can learn from how those groups have been able to engage with systems, indeed what universities or how education systems have done to engage with them. As much again can be learned, I'd say, from thinking about this issue. I did a book with a colleague here, looking at a few years ago, looking at the most marginalised groups in the world and how they relate to higher education. So it's worth thinking about this thing.
I agree with all of that, but I would also pick up on the group that I really, really worry about at the moment are those who outcomes may always have been poor because of the various experiences that we like to have of education generally, but who COVID have robbed of their chance to get the grades that would have taken them into an institution that may not have served them excellently, but would have meant that we knew where they were and we could support them. And we know that there were, thousands of students who should have gone into, who in normal circumstances would have gone into higher education in the last 2 years, but who appear to have fallen out because they didn't end up getting the grades because they weren't in school for a period of time, for example. And we are going to have, COVID is, the disease may be more or less over, but it is not over for any of us. We've got 15 years at least, the long-term consequences of what it means to shut your public school system for 18 months to 2 years. And what that does, it takes every single problem you have, makes it worse, makes it much worse disproportionately for the most disadvantaged. It's a huge problem there. The interesting thing, I think, in our system is that, it's my job to worry about who gets in, who meets the grades to get in, are they getting in? Who was worried about the people who, on any objective measure, don't have yet qualifications to go into higher education usefully? And what will we do about them and who will support them? Is it FB, is it someone else? I think that's a question that needs a stronger answer, but it's not only for me as the regulator to answer that, it's for government.
Thank you. And on that gloomy note, sorry, I'd just like
Sunny or outside.
thank the whole panel for a fantastic. I think now we have a very short break, but really probably enough time to make our way to the next room. So do have a brief chat, but then the next sessions will start at 20 past.